I used to assume there was something wrong with me and that if I talked less, smiled more, and tried harder, he would love me. But no matter what I did, my dad never looked at me the way he looked at my brothers. He never looked at me with pride or warmth, just indifference. My name is Stella, and when I was a kid, I was the only one in my family who wasn't visible. Richard, my dad, wasn't the kind of person who yelled. He never yelled because he didn't have to. Everything he said was in his silence. My dad hardly nodded when I received consecutive A's in middle school. But when my brother Jake passed a class he had been failing, Dad clapped him on the back and said, "That's my boy." I first realized it when I was 12. It was the day for fathers. I spent hours crafting a card and adorning it with glitter stickers and a poem I wrote. After supper, I gave it to him, my little heart full of hope. He looked at it, said thanks, and then went back to watching TV. 5 minutes later, my brother Ryan came in and gave Dad a store-bought mug that said, "Number 1 Dad." Dad acted like he had just won a trophy at the Super Bowl. I recall standing there with the card still in my hand, wondering why mine wasn't enough. That's how it always ended up. I was never good enough. Ryan and Jake were the golden boys. Ryan was the athlete, always breaking school records and getting write-ups in the local paper. Jake was the smooth talker, charming teachers, relatives, and anyone who crossed his path. And me? I was the quiet one, the moody one, the girl who spent too much time in her room writing stories or drawing. My mother used to try to balance things out. She'd hug me tight and whisper, "You're special too, sweetheart." But even she knew the hierarchy in our house. If Ryan wanted the last slice of pizza, he got it. If Jake needed money, Dad handed it over, no questions asked. I once asked for a new sketchbook, and Dad said, "What's the point? You'll quit halfway like everything else." That cut deeper than he'll ever know. At dinner, I'd sit quietly while Dad asked my brothers about their plans, their goals, their day. He never asked me, not once. If I spoke up, it was usually met with a dismissive grunt or forced smile. I learned to stay quiet, to not interrupt the boys' spotlight. But inside me, something was growing, not just sadness, something sharper, anger, a determination I couldn't yet name. I started working harder, pushing myself to excel, not because I thought he'd notice, but because I wanted to matter to someone, even if it was just myself. I stopped trying to win his love. Instead, I focused on building a life he couldn't ignore, a version of me he'd have no choice but to see. I was tired of being the forgotten daughter. One day, I promised myself he'd remember me, not as the quiet girl he dismissed, but as the woman who changed everything. If you ever walked into our house during the holidays, you'd think you were watching a commercial for the perfect American family, laughter echoing from the kitchen, my brothers throwing a football in the backyard, Dad grinning with a beer in hand. But I knew the truth. I knew what it felt like to be the background in someone else's highlight reel. My brothers, Jake and Ryan, were born to shine, at least that's how my father made it seem. Jake, the eldest, could charm the stripes off a tiger. He was the guy who never studied, but somehow still passed with a wink and a smirk. Dad adored him. They had inside jokes, matching fishing hats, and a handshake they'd made up when Jake was 10. I remember watching them once from the hallway as Jake showed Dad a business idea scribbled on a napkin. Dad looked at him like he'd just solved world hunger. "Atta boy," he said, clapping him on the back. "You've got the brain of a leader." Ryan, the youngest, was the golden athlete. Soccer trophies lined his shelves. Dad went to every game, rain or shine, and screamed from the sidelines like a proud high school coach. After Ryan scored a winning goal, Dad threw a full backyard party, barbecue, music, neighbors invited. I was there too, of course, setting out plates, cleaning up. Me? I got a good job once, when I was accepted into the honors program, just once. No party, no dinner, just a passing sentence during breakfast, in between bites of toast. Honors, huh? That's nice. I studied late into the night, pushed myself in every class, took part-time jobs to afford extra courses. I earned certificates, won quiet awards, even got a scholarship. But my success never sparkled the way others did in his eyes. At family dinners, Dad would beam with pride as he talked about Jake's new startup, Ryan's training camp. I'd mention my internship at a prestigious firm, and he'd nod, then turn back to my brothers. Anyway, he'd say, "Jake, tell them about that investor meeting." The message was loud and clear. They were the main event. I was the intermission. But the most painful part? I didn't hate my brothers. They were never cruel to me. They loved the spotlight, sure, but they didn't shove me into the dark. It was my father who did that, and I couldn't understand why. I tried everything, being helpful, being independent, being successful. Nothing worked. Sometimes I wondered if he even realized the way his favoritism crushed me. Other times, I knew he did and just didn't care. I told myself to let it go, to focus on myself, to not need his validation. But deep down, I still wished for it. Just once, I wanted him to say, "I'm proud of you, Stella," not because he had to, but because he meant it. That moment never came. But another one did, one that would change everything, not in the way he expected, and certainly not in the way he wanted. It was supposed to be my moment, the culmination of years spent burning the midnight oil, sacrificing social nights, and drowning in self-doubt. I had built my small startup, an innovative digital platform that was set to revolutionize the local market. It wasn't just a business, it was the embodiment of every late night, every tear, and every quiet moment of determination. I had poured my soul into it, believing that, finally, my worth would be undeniable. The launch event was held in a sleek, modern conference room downtown. Investors, local press, and industry leaders poured in, their eyes full of curiosity and anticipation. I took the stage with a trembling mix of excitement and fear, my heart pounding as if trying to escape the confines of my chest. I began to speak about my vision, the countless hurdles overcome, and the promise of a brighter future that my platform represented. The room was silent, hanging on to every word I uttered. For the first time, I felt seen, really seen, for what I'd achieved on my own merit. After the presentation, the energy in the room shifted. Handshakes and congratulations flowed in, and I even caught snippets of praise from seasoned investors who saw potential in my work. With a cautious smile, I made my way to a quieter corner, allowing myself a brief moment of relief and pride. Yet, as the evening progressed, that pride would soon be shattered. Later that week, the family gathered at home for a celebratory dinner, a habitual reunion that was as much about showcasing accomplishments as it was about displaying hierarchy. In the softly lit dining room, my brothers arrived with their usual effortless confidence, each exchanging stories of victories and milestones. The air was thick with unspoken triumphs that had long been crystallized into our family's tradition of favoritism. When the dinner began, my father, Richard, took his customary seat at the head of the table. Conversation flowed, but inevitably, the topic turned to achievements. I expected a moment of quiet acknowledgement, a nod, a word of respect. But instead, the narrative swiftly pivoted. My father, with his practiced ease, began recounting the family's latest feats. "Ryan hit his third home run this season," he said, his voice brimming with pride, pausing for laughter from the gathered kin. "And Jake, I hear you've sealed another major deal for your new venture. Fantastic work, son." His words rolled out like well-rehearsed lines at a family play, each one earning its due applause. I cleared my throat, attempting to insert my voice into the conversation. "I've just launched my own venture," I began, hopeful. But before I could elaborate, my father interjected with a dismissive gesture. "Yes, yes, we know you're busy, dear," he said lightly, almost as if he were referring to an insignificant chore. The room fell into a brief, awkward lull. A few nods were exchanged, but no one picked up on my intended pitch of triumph. That brief dismissal, that cold interruption, sent a shock through me. I remembered the countless times I had announced my small victories, only to have them reduced to mere background noise, overshadowed by the loud accolades of my brothers. In that moment, the weight of every ignored effort, every snubbed compliment, and every unspoken disregard crashed down like a tidal wave. The seeds of change had been sown. Sitting there, amidst the clamor of celebration for my brothers, I felt a fierce, burning clarity. I realized that no matter how far I climbed or how many milestones I reached, I would never be acknowledged by the person whose approval I had craved for so long. It was in that heart-shattering instant that I understood I could no longer play the quiet part in this tragic family drama. I would build a life so brilliant, so undeniable, that he could no longer dismiss me. And if he continued to steal my moments, then perhaps he'd finally face the consequences of his endless favoritism. After that dinner, something inside me shut down, not out of anger, but clarity. I stopped trying, not in the sense of giving up, but in the sense of no longer seeking approval that would never come. I didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't ask to be heard anymore. I simply went quiet. I started spending less time at family gatherings and more time in silence, just me and my goals. I moved out of the city, rented a modest but quiet apartment on the edge of town, and dove into my work like it was oxygen. The startup that I had launched, barely noticed by my own family, was now my world. It didn't pay much at first. I had weeks where dinner was just toast and instant coffee. I had to take freelance projects on the side to stay afloat. There were nights I cried quietly under my desk, questioning if I was even built for this. But for every doubt, there was a flicker of determination. I had no one clapping for me, no one cheering me on, but I was finally building for myself. I learned to fix bugs, write pitches, handle rejections, and chase clients with a kind of hunger only someone used to being overlooked could ever understand. Some nights, I would scroll through social media and see photos of Jake at business conferences with Dad by his side or Ryan holding yet another trophy with a caption about making the family proud. I'd feel that familiar sting, like a wound reopening, but I didn't let it stop me. Instead, I'd take a deep breath, close the app, and get back to work. My success wouldn't come from applause, it would come from perseverance. I grew in silence, no fancy updates, no family newsletters, just long nights, stubborn effort, and the occasional client saying, "You're the only one who actually listened to what we needed." Those words felt better than anything my father could have said because they were real. After a year, the company started gaining traction. Our user base grew. A niche investor found potential in what we were doing and poured in seed money. I finally hired a small team, people who, like me, knew what it felt like to be underestimated. Together, we built something incredible. Still, I stayed quiet. I didn't send out the usual holiday emails. I didn't show up at family events with success stories to toss around like confetti. I let them assume I was the same girl in the background, living small. That's how I wanted it. But within me, everything was changing. My posture shifted, my voice got firmer. I wasn't afraid to take up space anymore. I didn't need their validation. I had found something better. I had found me. For the first time in my life, I made decisions without second guessing. I bought my first car on my own. I signed the lease to a sleek office space with floor-to-ceiling windows, and I did it without needing someone to tell me, "Good job." I became the woman I had once only dreamed of becoming, the one my younger self thought she had to become for them. But now, I was doing it for me. And in all that silence, I was building something far more powerful than a career. I was building freedom. I still remember the first time I walked past a mirror and didn't flinch. My reflection didn't look like the forgotten daughter anymore. She looked like someone who had clawed her way out of invisibility and created a life of her own design. And it wasn't loud or flashy. It was quiet strength, the kind that doesn't beg to be seen but can't be ignored. And soon, they wouldn't be able to ignore me either, not after what I was about to do. I hadn't been home in almost 2 years, not for birthdays, not for holidays, not even for the obligatory phone calls. The silence was mutual. No one reached out to check on me, and I didn't expect them to. That's the thing about being forgotten. You eventually become comfortable with your own absence. But this year, I made a decision. I RSVP'd to the annual Father's Day dinner. No explanation, no follow-up, just a simple, "I'll be there," in the family group chat. The reactions were a mix of emojis and passive silence. I could almost feel the awkwardness through the screen. The night before, I stood in front of a sleek black luxury car in a dealership showroom, signing paperwork under a fake last name I had legally changed to after launching my business. They wouldn't even recognize it. None of them had ever asked what I was doing or who I was becoming. Next to me sat a small black envelope. The edges were crisp, the paper heavy and expensive. Inside was a single legal document that would change everything. Father's Day arrived. I dressed carefully, not to impress, but to remind myself who I had become. Confidence in every inch of fabric, power in every step. When I pulled into the driveway, the car's engine purred like a warning. My siblings were already there, clinking glasses and laughing on the patio. Dad was at the head of the table, grinning wide, drink in hand, the favorite role he played so well. His eyes flicked toward me, and for a moment, confusion broke through his usual smugness. Then a smile. Well, look who finally decided to show up. Everyone turned. I could feel their surprise and judgment settle into the air. I smiled politely. Hi, everyone. Happy Father's Day, Dad. The dinner was the same mix of forced laughs and subtle jabs. Jake talked about his new condo. Ryan bragged about another promotion. Dad nodded and beamed like a king surrounded by princes. And then came the moment. I stood up slowly, the quiet drawing everyone's attention. I brought something for you, Dad, I said, looking directly at him. I walked outside, leaving the door open behind me. Moments later, I drove the luxury car into the driveway, sleek, black, impossible to ignore. I got out, walked back inside, and laid the small black envelope on the table in front of him. For you, Dad. Happy Father's Day. Gasps rippled through the room. Is that a car? Jake asked, squinting toward the driveway. Ryan leaned forward. Wait, you bought that? Dad looked from the keys to me, completely stunned. He picked up the envelope, his fingers trembling a little. What's this? Just open it, I said quietly, my voice calm and steady. Everyone leaned in as he slipped the paper out. For a second, his expression didn't change. Then his eyes started darting over the page, and slowly, his face drained of color. His jaw clenched. What is this? He barked, now glaring at me. I gave him a long, unreadable smile. Read it carefully. You'll see. And with that, I turned, walked out the door, and got into the car. I drove away as the shouting started behind me. Because that envelope? It wasn't just paper. It was the ownership document of the company that had just acquired the firm he worked for. His job, his pride, his status, all now under my control. Happy Father's Day indeed. The house looked the same, tastefully decorated, spotless, cold. My mother moved in and out of the dining room like a silent shadow, refilling glasses and smiling at jokes that weren't funny. My brothers were already a few drinks in, and the air felt thick with old habits and unspoken rules. I sat quietly at the end of the table, the black envelope resting in my purse, heavy like a heartbeat. The car keys were tucked safely into my coat pocket, parked just outside the window in full view of the driveway. The conversation swirled around me like I wasn't even there. Ryan talked about his latest investment win. Jake cracked jokes about people who still rent. Dad, of course, nodded in approval, soaking in the pride like sunlight. So, how's business, Dad? Jake asked, lifting his glass. Dad chuckled. Busy as always, but not everyone is cut out for this kind of pressure. Takes real backbone. He looked at Ryan. Good thing I've got two sons who aren't afraid to lead. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. It wasn't even subtle anymore. Then he glanced down the table toward me. I could feel the moment shift before he even opened his mouth. And then there's the loser sitting at the table, he said, gesturing toward me with a smirk. Still pretending to be the black sheep, huh? The laughter exploded. Jake nearly choked on his drink. Ryan laughed so hard he had to slap the table. My hands stayed folded in my lap. I didn't blink. I didn't smile. I just waited. When the laughter finally died down, I stood up slowly, calmly, the way you move when you already know how the story ends. I actually brought you something, Dad, I said, pulling the envelope from my purse. A little Father's Day gift. The room stilled. Even the air seemed to pause. I walked down the length of the table and placed the envelope directly in front of him. He glanced at it, puzzled. What is this? Just open it, I said, then stepped back and folded my arms. He ripped the flap with dramatic flair, as if expecting a joke or cash. His fingers unfolded the paper, and as his eyes began to scan the words, the color in his face changed, first confusion, then disbelief, then a slow, creeping horror. What the hell is this? He asked, looking up at me, eyes narrowing. You remember Anderson Tech? The company you've worked at for the last 10 years? I said softly. It's under new ownership. A beat. I bought it, I continued, through a silent acquisition, effective last week. The silence was immediate, deafening. I leaned in slightly and added, so no, I'm not the loser at the table. I'm the woman who just became your boss's boss. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Jake looked pale. Ryan dropped his fork. And that car out front? I said, glancing toward the window. That was part of the presentation, but I'll be taking it with me now. I turned, without waiting for permission, walked outside, and slid into the driver's seat. The sound of the engine roared to life, and just as I pulled away, I heard it, his scream from the open front door. It wasn't anger, it was fear. The car's engine hummed steadily as I drove away from the house, the weight of what I had just done settling into my chest. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about something much deeper. For years, I had let myself shrink in the shadows of a family that never truly saw me, and now I was standing tall, casting a shadow they couldn't ignore. But the weight of the moment wasn't the only thing pulling at me. I knew what was happening behind me. I could picture it as clearly as if I were still sitting at that table, hearing the deafening silence that followed my words. I wasn't there anymore, but my actions would speak louder than anything I could have said. Back inside, my father's hands were shaking as he held the paper. He looked from it to his son's, his lips moving as though he were trying to find words that wouldn't come. I could see the panic beginning to bloom, creeping through every muscle in his body, spreading like a virus. Dad? Jake asked, his voice suddenly small. He stood up, coming around to where Dad sat, frozen, the paper still gripped tightly in his hands. What's going on? Ryan, the ever-confident one, had already stood up as well, trying to peek over their father's shoulder. What is that? It looks like, wait, is that real? Dad didn't answer. His eyes were glued to the document, his fingers skimming the words, but failing to make sense of them. The words on the page were simple enough, but for him, they were a death sentence. I could already hear their questions in my mind, the panic, the disbelief, the frantic rush to understand what was happening. They'd always relied on him for answers. Now, the answers were slipping away, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Finally, Jake couldn't take the silence anymore. Dad, what does it say? What's going on? Dad looked up, his face pale, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't catch his breath. It's a transfer of property, he muttered, his voice weak, a reversal of assets. All of it. The company, the house, my shares. The panic in his voice was palpable. His sons froze. Ryan blinked in disbelief. Wait, you're telling me this? This document means she owns everything? The realization hit them like a slap. The silence deepened, but this time, it wasn't awkward, it was suffocating. My father had always been the pillar, the one everyone turned to for stability. But now he was the one on his knees, his empire crumbling before his eyes. His sons had no idea how to process it. Jake staggered back from the table, his face going red. How the hell did she? How could she do this? He hissed, his voice rising in anger. She's nothing. We're the ones who worked for this. How could she? Dad held up a shaking hand, his mind still trying to catch up with the magnitude of what had just happened. She's not nothing, he said, his voice cracking. She's everything. Ryan's eyebrows furrowed, his earlier cockiness replaced with uncertainty. What do you mean, Dad? What's going on? How could she? She owns it all, Dad said, his voice barely a whisper. She owns the company. She owns the house. Everything. Everything I've worked for, it's hers now. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The sons, who had once worshipped their father, who had seen him as the king of their world, were now faced with a reality they could hardly comprehend. They hadn't even considered her as a contender. To them, I was the shadow, the forgotten one, the one who wasn't enough. But now I was the one who held the power. I don't understand, Jake said, his voice shaking now. How could she? When did this happen? Why didn't we know? Dad finally looked up, his face etched with defeat. She didn't want you to know. She didn't need to tell you. She doesn't need us. Ryan took a step back, trying to collect himself. But how did she get this much? How? She didn't ask for anything, Dad said, his voice cold now. She just took it. The room was frozen in disbelief, the wake of my quiet, calculated rise settling over them all. For the first time in their lives, my brothers were forced to confront the reality they had been so blind to for years. I was not the failure they thought I was. I was the one who had worked silently, without the applause, without the validation, and now everything they depended on was mine. My father let out a long, ragged sigh. She's smarter than I gave her credit for, he muttered, his voice barely audible, and I'll never be able to take that back. The fear, the panic, it was all there, written on their faces. But for me, it was the start of something new, the start of me taking my place in the world, not as the forgotten daughter, but as the woman who had finally earned her right to be seen. I didn't look back as I walked away from that house. The weight that had been holding me down for so long, the constant need to prove myself, the hunger for approval that would never come, finally lifted. I had made it, not because they'd recognized me, but because I had recognized myself. The phone buzzed with messages. The family was scrambling, trying to figure out what I had done, why I had left so suddenly, and what that paper meant. I knew they would be in shock, especially my father, but I didn't care. I had already taken what I needed from them, the power to stand on my own, to walk away from everything I had once thought I needed. I wasn't the girl they always ignored. I wasn't the daughter they thought they could control or dismiss. I was my own person now, free from the chains of their expectations. As the evening went on, I knew they were probably still sitting there, staring at that paper, trying to comprehend the magnitude of it. My father, who had always dismissed my efforts, would now understand what I was capable of, but it would be too late. All those years of neglect, of treating me as second best, had finally caught up with him. The house would never be the same. The balance of power had shifted, and I was no longer the one they could manipulate or overlook. The siblings, who had always competed for his affection, who had never seen me as a true equal, would finally understand that I wasn't just a side player in their world. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their love or their recognition. I had created a life for myself that didn't depend on them. I was successful, independent, and, finally, at peace. And when I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw someone who had fought for her place in the world, someone who didn't need to look back to know she had one. The door was closed. I had walked out, but I had also walked into my own future, one that was all mine.